Okay, we come now to the question of the historical accuracy of the Bible, and I want to deal first with the Old Testament. And there are essentially two questions that I want to answer here. The first is what we have written now in the Scriptures what was originally recorded? The second is, does the archaeological evidence confirm or deny what Scripture itself claims? So what reasons do we have for believing that our modern translations are faithful to what was originally recorded? Well, the earliest known complete manuscript copy of the Old Testament is something called the Masoretic text. It was written about AD 900 by a group of Jews known as the Masoretes, which makes it approximately 1,100 years old. Now, the Masoretes were particularly careful, some might say to the point of obsession, in their copying. For example, when copying a particular book from the Jewish scriptures, from what they called the Tanakh, which is essentially our Old Testament, when copying a particular book from the Tanakh, they would total up the number of letters in that book, and they would work out exactly which one was the middle letter. Now, if it didn't match exactly the original copy, then they would scrap it, throw it away, trash it, burn it, whatever. They would have to start again. And before them, a group known as the Talmudists, from about 100 to 500 AD, also had similar meticulous rules and regulations for copying Old Testament scripture. Samuel Davidson records some of them for us, from the more common sense ones like this, for example. No word or letter, not even a yod, must be written from memory, the scribe not having looked at the codex before him. And an authentic copy must be an exemplar from which the transcriber ought not in the least to deviate. Common sense, but there are also some which to our ears might seem a bit bizarre. For example, the copyist must sit in full Jewish dress, with wash his whole body, not begin to write the name of God with a pen newly dipped in ink, and should a king address him while writing that name, he must take no notice of him. You see, the copying of scripture from one generation to the next was no mere game of Chinese whispers. It was something far more meticulous, far more precise, far more careful than that. Imagine the care that would go into copying an ancient classic of literature, and multiply that perhaps by 100-fold, and you might begin to get somewhere close to just how these copyists revered, respected, and held the very words that they were copying, not merely as a classic of literature, not just as the history of their people, but as the very words of the living and eternal God. So these are some things that we need to take into consideration when thinking about this question about the reliability of the translations and the scriptures that we have before us today. The truth is, all present copies of the Hebrew text that come from the Masoretic period are in remarkable agreement. And when you compare the Masoretic text itself with earlier known Greek and Latin copies, it reveals very little deviation over a period of about 1,000 years. All well and good. But here's the problem. You see, the Masoretic text is the earliest complete copy of the Old Testament that we have. As I said, it dates from about 900 AD. Now we know that the Hebrew Scriptures was completed or reached its completion at about 400 BC. So whilst we might be able to assert that the Hebrew Scriptures remained intact from about 900 AD onwards to the present day, we have a period of about 1,300 years in which all sorts of errors quite conceivably could have occurred. And with no or little substantial manuscripts to compare the Masoretic text with from antiquity, who's to say that they didn't? A valid question, if you asked it in 1946 at the end of the Second World War. In 1947, a young Bedouin goat herder was out tending his goats in the valley of the Dead Sea. And he made what has perhaps amounted to the most exciting and important archaeological discovery of the 20th century, although he himself probably wasn't quite so aware of that. What he discovered inside a cave were jars of clay, and inside those jars of clay were leather scrolls. Now, the leather scrolls have since revealed that in the area there lived a monastic community from about 150 BC to about 70 AD. They've since become known as the Qumran community. You may have heard them, and they were responsible for the writings in those scrolls, writings which could be dated to about 100 BC. Now, the scrolls themselves amounted to fragments of almost every book of the Jewish scriptures. A tattered copy of the 2 books of Samuel, 2 complete chapters of the book of Habakkuk, and 2 copies of the book of Isaiah, one of the longest books in the Old Testament. One of those copies was fragmented and tattered. The other, and of far greater significance, was a complete and intact copy of the book of Isaiah. What this meant was that scholars now had something substantial from antiquity, from before Christ, to compare the Masoretic text with. And compare it they did. Let me quote for you what they learnt. A comparison of Isaiah 53 shows that only 17 letters differ from the Masoretic text. 10 of these are mere differences in spelling, like our honour, H-O-N-O-U-R in the English, and in the American H-O-N-O-R. And they produce no change in the meaning at all. 4 more are very minor differences, such as the presence of a conjunction, i.e. the word and, which are stylistic rather than substantive. The other 3 letters are the Hebrew word for light. This word was added to the text by someone after, in inverted commas, they shall see in verse 11. So out of that 166 words in this chapter, only this one word is really in question. And it does not at all change the meaning of the passage. Read it for yourself if you like, you'll see what I mean. We're told by biblical scholars that this is typical of the whole manuscript of Isaiah. What we have then is evidence of faithful, careful and meticulous copying of the Hebrew scriptures over a period of about 2,000 years. And I'm sure you'll agree that is a degree of accuracy seldom maintained in any short-term game or childhood game of Chinese whispers.